I didn't think I'd ever write this down, but here I am. Maybe it's some twisted form of confession. Maybe it's just to get it out of me before it rots my brain the way it rotted his. I knew Dr. Alan Greaves for almost 10 years before anyone realized what he was. We all knew he was odd, brilliant, but odd. He had this way of drifting off mid-conversation, like he was listening to someone we couldn't hear. His hands would twitch sometimes, a little too eager, even when we were just going over charts. But surgeons are all a little strange, right? You have to be, to cut into living people and not lose your mind. At least, that's what I told myself. I was the scrub nurse in his OR for over a decade. I stood inches from him, while he worked. I passed him scalpels, retracted tissue, suctioned blood from open cavities so he could see. I saw his hands do things that felt more like art than medicine. Even now, I can't deny the skill. But what I didn't see was what he was hiding. What he was becoming. The first time I knew something was truly wrong, it was just the two of us in the break room. It was late, near midnight, the floor almost empty. He was sitting at the table, peeling a hard-boiled egg with the surgical precision he couldn't turn off. As I walked in, his head snapped up so fast it made me jump. "Do you ever think about what's inside you?" he asked, his voice flat. I laughed, confused. "What, like organs?" He didn't laugh. He just stared, his eyes too wide, too focused. "Most people don't think about it," he said. "They forget they're filled with soft things. They trust us to keep it all in." I tried to make a joke, something about horror movies or med school pranks, but he wasn't listening. He was looking past me, at the wall, or maybe at something inside it. Something I couldn't see. "They're all so soft," he said again, almost whispering. "They don't even fight." I left the room after that. I didn't say anything to anyone because what do you say? The surgeon's acting weird? They all do. Stress, sleep deprivation, it's part of the culture. But something about the way he said it stuck with me, like a hook behind my ribs. The first patient I think he killed was a middle-aged woman, routine appendectomy. No complications, no red flags. I was right there beside him, same as always. He was calm, steady. His hands didn't shake. The anesthesia was fine. Her vitals were stable. And then, for no reason, he cut too deep. I remember the sound it made, that soft, slick tear, like pulling apart raw chicken. Blood filled the cavity faster than I could suction it away. I tried to speak, to ask if he needed help, but he just shook his head once, eyes locked on the wound like it was speaking to him. She bled out in minutes. He called it a rare arterial anomaly. A freak accident. No one questioned him, his reputation was too solid. And mistakes happen, even to the best. But as we cleaned up, I saw something I still can't explain. When he thought no one was looking, he slipped something into the pocket of his scrub pants. Something small. Something red. I wanted to believe I imagined it. Surgeries are chaotic. It could have been a piece of gauze, a blood-stained tool, anything. That's what I told myself while I scrubbed her blood from the floor. But my gut wouldn't let it go. And it kept happening. The next patient was a man in his 40s, scheduled for a simple gallbladder removal. Healthy, fit, no major issues. I prepped him myself, joking with him while I shaved the area. He was nervous, they all are, but he smiled at my bad jokes. I remember that smile. It was gone less than an hour later. Dr. Greaves was different during that case. Slower. His hands moved like he was savoring every slice, every separation of muscle from fascia, every layer of skin peeled back. Surgeons work fast. Precision is about economy of motion, not dragging things out. But that day he lingered. I caught him pressing his gloved fingertips to the man's exposed liver, like he was trying to feel it breathe. I asked if something was wrong, and he muttered something about soft chambers, and how quiet it is inside. And then he nicked an artery. Again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Blood erupted, spraying his mask, my gown, even the overhead lights. I started calling for help, but Greaves didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the man's open belly, like it was showing him something only he could see. By the time we got the bleeding under control, the man was gone. Officially, it was a rare vascular malformation. An unavoidable tragedy. Happens sometimes. But I saw his hand, saw the way he reached into that cavity before we closed, fingers curling around something, slipping it into his sleeve. After that, I started watching him. Really watching him. He always offered to handle the post-op cleanup himself. Said it was part of his process, a way to respect the patient, to see them through to the end. No one questioned it. But once I knew what to look for, I saw the gaps. The tiny things no one noticed. Missing tissue samples. Organs that were incomplete. Discrepancies in the weights logged by pathology. The official reports never matched my memory of the surgeries. A pancreas that was smaller than expected. A lung lobe that looked nibbled, almost. Pathologists chalked it up to trauma during surgery. No one wanted to accuse a surgeon like Greaves of sloppiness. But I saw the way he touched his mask when no one was looking. The way his jaw would move, slow, rhythmic, like he was chewing something. The voice in my head kept saying, "No. It's not possible. This is a man with awards, published papers, residents who idolize him. This is the man who trained me, who saved countless lives. He couldn't, be eating them. Could he?" I started digging after that. Not officially, no one would have believed me. But in private, on my own time, I went through old records. Cases he handled alone. Complications, unexplained deaths, patients who went into surgery for something minor and never woke up. There were more than I expected. A lot more. And they stretched back years, long before I ever stepped into that or with him. I found a pattern no one else had pieced together because no one wanted to look too hard. Surgeons with his credentials, his success rate, they're given the benefit of the doubt. Always. But I couldn't stop thinking about the things he said when he thought no one could hear him. One night, I was on call, stuck on the graveyard shift, and I heard him talking to himself in the empty or no patients. No staff. Just him, standing at the table in the dark, whispering. At first I thought he was praying. Some surgeons do that, weird little rituals to steady their nerves. But then I realized, he wasn't talking to himself. He was answering. I couldn't hear the other voice, but he could. He was holding his hands out in front of him, fingers flexing like they were submerged in something thick, something alive. His head tilted to the side, like he was straining to catch every word, nodding along to a rhythm I couldn't hear. "They all want to be eaten," he said softly, like it was a simple fact. "They just don't know it." I wanted to run, to pretend I didn't hear it, but something inside me, some sick part of my brain, wanted to know more. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows, just close enough to see the gleam of sweat on his face. His mask was down, his mouth slightly open, and I could see the tip of his tongue running along his teeth. He was savoring something that wasn't there. That's when he turned, so fast I almost fell backwards. But his eyes didn't see me. They were glassy, unfocused, staring past me the way you stare at a window at night, seeing nothing but your own reflection. "She's watching," he whispered. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like his at all, something raw and wet and wrong. "She wants to know what they taste like." I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. I started avoiding his cases when I could, trading shifts, switching teams. But I couldn't stay away forever. Because eventually, I realized something. It wasn't just a compulsion. It wasn't some sudden break or secret addiction. It was a conversation. Something inside him was answering back. I wish I could say I went to someone right then. Reported him. Walked into the chief of surgery's office and laid it all out. Hell, I wish I could say I even tried. But I didn't. Because I was afraid. Not just of Greaves, though I was terrified of him by then, but of what it would mean if I was right. If the man who taught me, who stood inches from me for years, had been doing this. And because part of me wondered if it was already too late. See, there's something you need to understand about surgeons. We're not supposed to get attached. Not to patients, not to each other. You have to be able to cut into a living person, to crack open their ribs, to pull them apart, and not let it feel like them. You focus on the anatomy, the systems, the parts. Not the person. That's the only way you survive. But Greaves, he was attached to them. Not in a human way. Not empathy. It was something darker, something that went beyond fascination. He wasn't just opening them up, he was getting to know them from the inside out. Intimately. And he was taking pieces of them with him. I started going through his locker when he was in surgery, hands shaking the whole time. At first, I found nothing but the usual: deodorant, old scrubs, a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. But taped to the back wall, where no one would ever look unless they were searching for it, I found the photos. Organs. Close-ups. Livers, kidneys, intestines, laid out in neat little rows, like a butcher's display case. But some of them had bite marks. At first I thought it was some sick joke, photos from a forensic case, something from his residency. But the dates were recent. And the backgrounds, they were our ORs. Our tables. Our lights. Our patients. There were notes, too, scribbled on the backs of the pictures in his neat, surgeon's handwriting. Too fibrous. Sweet, slight bitterness. Perfectly tender. He wasn't just cutting them up. He was tasting them. Judging them. Cataloging them like a chef learning new ingredients. And the worst part, the part that made me clamp my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming, was the last photo. It wasn't an organ. It was me. The photo was old, maybe 6 months, maybe longer. I could tell by my hair, the way it was still in that too-tight ponytail I used to wear before the headaches got bad. I was standing at the scrub sink, back to the camera, hands raised mid-wash. I didn't even know he was there. But the caption on the back told me everything. Soft, with good muscle tone. Likely tender. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there in that locker room, surrounded by the stink of disinfectant and stale sweat, my own heart thudding so hard it felt like a countdown. I don't remember how long I stood there, but eventually I heard his voice, not in my head, but real, just outside the door. Forgot my phone, he said, casual, like it was any other day. You seen it? My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I was frozen between fight and flight, between screaming and silence. And I knew deep down that he knew. He knew I was in there. He knew I had seen the photos. And he was waiting to see what I'd do. When I finally stepped out, I tried to play it off. Shaky smile, shrug. Haven't seen it. He looked me up and down, the way a butcher might size up a side of beef, and gave me that smile I'd seen him flash at grieving families. Let me know if you find it, he said. That was the night I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. For the next week, I was on edge every second. I caught him watching me during cases, just a fraction too long, his gaze drifting to my neck, my arms. I imagined I could feel his hands tracing the planes of my ribs, picturing where he'd cut first. But it wasn't just me. The surgeries got worse. There was a young woman, healthy, 22, in for a laparoscopic cyst removal. Should have been textbook, 3 tiny incisions, an hour tops. But Greaves opened her all the way up. A full laparotomy, guts splayed like he was performing an autopsy instead of a routine procedure. He kept asking for retractors, widening the incision until I could see her whole abdominal cavity, glistening, pink, alive. I whispered, Dr. Greaves, we don't need. But he cut me off with a glance. Not angry. Hungry. He reached inside her with both hands, fingers curling into her intestines, stroking them like a lover's skin. And then, God, I swear this is true, he lifted them to his face and inhaled. Not a sniff. A deep breath, like he was breathing her in. I gagged behind my mask, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the suction. He finished the procedure like nothing happened, closed her up, and she survived, but something was missing. A small section of bowel, nothing anyone would notice. I knew where it went. I knew what he was eating in the dark. And I knew, if I didn't get out, I'd be next. I started avoiding him any way I could. Switched shifts, volunteered for overnight admits, even begged to rotate to the emergency department. Anything to put distance between me and Greaves. But hospitals have gravity, and surgeons like him? They always pull you back. It was maybe a week after that bowel case when I found myself alone in the ore supply room, stocking sterile kits. The door was propped open to the dim hallway beyond, and I heard it, his voice. Quiet. Murmuring. At first, I thought he was on the phone. But no one talks to a phone like that, soft, tender, almost loving. I crept closer, breath held tight in my chest, until I could hear the words. Are you still hungry? A pause. They're not as tender as you. Another pause. Yes. I'll find you more. My skin went cold, every hair on my body standing straight up. He wasn't talking to himself. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to someone inside him. I stepped back, trying to make as little noise as possible, but my foot hit a tray of clamps, and they went clattering to the floor. The sound exploded down the hall like a gunshot. He went silent. I froze, hoping, praying, that he hadn't heard. But then the silence shifted, a soft, slick sound, like gloves peeling off skin. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. He stepped into the doorway, and for the first time, I saw him without the mask of professionalism he always wore around others. His eyes were glassy, bloodshot, and the skin under them sagged like he hadn't slept in weeks. There was something wet smeared just under his chin, a dark spot he hadn't wiped clean. Blood? Or something worse. Are you following me? He asked, but his voice wasn't accusing. It was amused. Like we were playing a game, one where we both knew the rules but only he knew the ending. No, I whispered. Just restocking. He took a step closer, so close I could smell him, antiseptic, sweat, and beneath it all, a faint, metallic tang. Like pennies on his breath. I'm glad you're here, he said. I've been meaning to ask you something. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. What? He smiled, wide enough to show his teeth. Do you ever wonder what you taste like? I left the supplies on the floor and walked out. Didn't run, not until I hit the stairwell, but every step felt like I was holding back a scream. Because the way he said it, so casual, so matter-of-fact, told me the truth. He wasn't wondering. He already knew. I didn't go home that night. Couldn't. I knew if I went back to my apartment, if I walked through that door and locked it behind me, I'd be alone. And if Greaves decided to visit, no one would hear me scream. So I stayed at the hospital. I told myself it was safer, that at least there were people around, but that was a lie. Because Greaves didn't need to follow me home. His hunting ground was right here, under bright lights and stainless steel, with consent forms and sterile drapes. No one would ever question what a surgeon was doing alone with a patient's body. I knew I had to find something undeniable, something that would make the administration listen. Rumors wouldn't cut it. Nurses are always whispering about doctors with shaky hands, missing drugs, whispered affairs. But this was bigger. This was evil. I started searching every moment I could. His office. The records room. The storage closets where he thought no one went. And after 3 days of barely sleeping, I found it, hidden in a locked cabinet in the old surgical wing, the one they only used for overflow trauma cases. A cooler. No label. Just shoved behind a stack of outdated procedure manuals. My hands shook so hard I could barely pop the latches. The smell hit me first, copper and rot, thick enough to coat my tongue. Inside were vacuum-sealed bags, the kind you use for sous vide cooking. Only these weren't steaks. Lungs. Kidneys. Pieces of intestines coiled like sausage links. All neatly packed, dated, and labeled. J. Collins, 12/03. M. Rivera, 12 out of 10. Unidentified, tender, slight marbling, 12/19. He was aging them. Like cuts of meat. There was a folder, too, tucked beside the cooler, with pages of handwritten notes. Not medical notes. Tasting notes. Too young, muscle too stringy. Sweetness in the fat layer, vegetarian diet? Older, gamey, but tolerable after searing. I flipped through page after page, my vision blurring, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Each entry was more detailed than the last: preparation methods, preferred cooking times, notes on texture. And there, at the very end, was my name. Prime specimen, observed muscle tone, low body fat. Likely delicate. Next to it was a date. 3 days from now. My surgery. I had no surgery booked. None. I wasn't even due for a physical. But there it was, clear as day, my name, the date, and a procedure code. Exploratory laparotomy. It was bullshit. A made-up surgery. Something you only do when there's a catastrophic injury, when you have no choice but to open someone up and figure out what's wrong. But Greaves had written it down like it was already set. Like I was already on the table. I stood there in that forgotten hallway, the stench of his collection sticking to the back of my throat, trying to remember how to breathe. 3 days. That's all the time I had to figure out if I could stop him. Or run. I took photos, every bag, every page of his notebook. My hands were shaking so badly some of them came out blurry, but I didn't care. I just needed proof, something solid. Then I put everything back exactly the way I found it. If he knew I'd seen it, I was dead. The next morning, I went straight to the chief of surgery. I didn't sleep, didn't eat. I just stood outside his office until his secretary unlocked the door. I told him everything, the missing tissue, the bizarre behavior, the cooler, the notes. I even showed him the photos. He barely looked at them. "We'll handle this internally," he said. That's the phrase hospitals use when they're more afraid of lawsuits than serial killers. Dr. Greaves is a respected member of our staff. He's saved countless lives. Stress affects everyone differently. I was dismissed by lunch. No follow-up. No investigation. Just a warning not to spread baseless rumors. And that's when I knew. If I stayed, I wouldn't make it to the end of the week. I thought about quitting, just walking out the door and never coming back. But that's the thing about people like Greaves. They don't just let you go. Not when you've seen inside them. I had to be smarter. I had to make him think I didn't suspect a thing. So I smiled through my shifts, stood beside him in the OR, handed him scalpels, pretended I couldn't feel his eyes crawling over me like hands, measuring, weighing, deciding where he'd start cutting. I had one chance to get ahead of him. And I knew exactly where I'd find it. There's something they never teach you in nursing school, how hospitals are built like living things. Layers of history, rooms no one uses anymore, hallways that don't make sense because they were built for a building that's long gone. It was in one of those places, a storage room at the end of a corridor so old the lights flickered like candles, that I found the second cooler. This one wasn't hidden. Not really. It sat on an old surgical cart, the kind they don't use anymore, wheels rusted stiff. The lid was open when I found it, like he wanted someone to see. Inside was a heart. Not preserved. Not bagged. Just there. Fresh. Still glistening. A pale slice missing from one side, like someone had taken a delicate bite and set it aside for later. I should have run. My whole body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. Not until I knew whose it was. There was a folder next to the cooler, much thinner than the one I'd found before. Just a few pages, handwritten in that same neat, careful script. The voices say she's almost ready. I want to taste her while she's still warm. I wonder if her heart will taste different, knowing how fast it beats when I'm near. The date was today. He was talking about me. I don't remember leaving that room. My next clear memory is standing in the staff bathroom, scrubbing my hands so hard the skin peeled away. I couldn't get the smell off me. Metallic, sweet, rotting under the surface. I knew there was no point going to the chief again. They'd already decided I was hysterical. So I did the only thing left. I wrote a resignation letter, stuffed it in my locker, and decided I'd vanish before my next shift. No goodbyes. Just gone. But when I got to my locker, the door was already ajar. Inside was my scrub top, folded perfectly. And on top of it, a single note. Don't worry. I'll find you. I didn't go home that night. I didn't go anywhere I thought he could find me, not my sister's place, not the apartment I'd lived in for years. I checked into a motel on the edge of town, the kind where they don't ask for ID if you pay cash. I locked the door. Jammed a chair under the handle. Slept with a scalpel in my hand, tucked under the pillow. I knew it wouldn't be enough if he found me. I'd seen how fast his hands could work, how precise. But it was better than nothing. That was 2 years ago. I've moved 3 times since then. Changed my name twice. I don't work in hospitals anymore, can't even stand the smell of disinfectant without wanting to vomit. Every time I hear a voice behind me, too soft to make out, I freeze. Because I know he's still out there. They never fired him. Never investigated. In fact, last I heard, he's still practicing. Different hospital, different state, but still cutting, still holding lives in those hands. And every so often, not often, but just enough to make my stomach drop, I get something in the mail. No return address. No note. Just a small, vacuum-sealed bag. Meat. I never open them. Never check. But I know. He's still tasting. And someday, he'll come looking for me again. Because in his mind, I was never a nurse. Never a person. I was just another meal he never finished.